Okay, let's work on our billing config now. So there's a couple of places we want to go for that under the financial menu, and then under billing we have billing configuration and billing defaults. We're going to start with billing configuration. And this defines a lot of the basic config in Sonar as to how we want to bill, what we want to have happen when we bill, and those kinds of things. So let's run through this from the top. My first option is, do I want to generate an invoice on initial activation? So this is when an account is first activated, and it could be activated manually, or it could be activated automatically as part of, for example, closing out an install successfully. Do we want to generate an invoice right away? If we turn this on, then any prorated charges on the account, any install fees, anything like that will all get pulled up into this invoice, and we'll have a single invoice there prior to their first billing that will contain any of those initial charges. If it's off, then those charges would just sit on the account and they would get included in the invoice on the first billing cycle. So this is really up to you. Do you want to collect a proration of the first month or an install fee or anything like that up front, or do you wait for billing to run for the first time? If we turn this on, we have an option as to whether or not we want to email an initial activation invoice to the customer. I'm going to say yes, I do. Next section is billing here, and our first option is automatic prorating. If you recall back to when we were creating users, one of the options we had there when we built the role was an account superuser permission, and this is a case where that would apply. If a user does not have the account superuser permission, they will not be able to override this proration setting. If they do, then they will. So for all of our typical users, like the customer support role we created with a not an account superuser, whatever I pick here, it's going to enforce certain behavior for those users. So if this is on, then any event that can prorate will. So some example of events that would prorate would be adding a service to an active customer. This would automatically prorate a charge out to the next billing date. Removing a service from an active customer, this would prorate a credit for the remainder of the time they've already paid for. Or making an account active that has a billing date in the future. If there's any services on the account, it would prorate those services up to the next billing date. Those kinds of things. So I'm going to leave this on. I want to prorate those kind of charges. Now our next options here are all about autopay. So if this is on, autopay runs entire amount due. If I have a customer set to autopay, so if we're going to automatically charge their credit card or bank account when we bill them, this would bill them the entire amount due on the account. If this is off, it would only bill them for the new charges as part of that billing cycle. So let's say customer owes $50 from the last invoice, they haven't paid it yet. We run billing and they owe $100 on the new invoice. With this on, we charge them $150, the full amount due on the account. If this is off, we'd only charge them the $100 onto their credit card or bank account, which would be the current amount that's run for this billing cycle. Down below this we have an option for the number of attempts we want to make on different payment methods, as well as the interval between them. So this is fairly simple. If this is 5 and 2, this means we're going to try to run a credit card 5 times on a 2-day interval, and it'll only retry if it failed the first time. So say we try to run the card on Monday, it fails, we're going to wait 2 days, so on Wednesday we'll try and run the card again. And if that fails, we'll wait 2 days and we'll run it on Friday until we've made 5 attempts. Option down below here is the same thing, but for ACH or eCheck, depending on what you're using. So if you're charging their bank account and it fails, do you want to retry that? That's what those settings do. This option allows us to round prorated amounts to the nearest dollar. You probably don't want to enable this. Some people do, but generally you would leave this off, and then what will happen is if the prorated amount is, say, $1.54, we'll charge them $1.54. If this is on, we charge them $2. Next option is about taxation. Do we want to round taxes up, or do we want to round them to the nearest value? If taxation means that we end up calculating an amount that's less than a penny, so let's say our tax amount is $1.53.5 or $1.53.1, do we want to always round that up, or do we want to round it to nearest? So if this is off, we would round $1.53.1 down to 53. If this is on, we'd round that same value up to 54. Minimum amount owed on an invoice to be considered delinquent. This is set to $1 by default. If we make this more, then an invoice would be allowed to be delinquent or past due by whatever amount is here without actually being flagged delinquent. So the reason you might want to set this is you can enable certain behaviors in Sonar that'll happen when an account becomes delinquent. We can shut off their service, we can send them a nasty email, and we can trigger all kinds of events. So if I don't want to shut people off because they owe, let's say, $5 or less, I could set this to $5, and then an invoice won't actually be marked delinquent unless there's at least $5 owed on it. Daily billing on or off. If I turn this on, Sonar is going to begin billing. So it's going to look for customers that are due to be billed every day, and it's going to bill them, it's going to charge their cards, do whatever you've configured. Until your system's fully set up, you're not going to want to turn this on, but once everything's set up and you're ready to start billing, we're going to want to enable this. So just remember this is here. This is also on that checklist on the front page that we covered in the first video. So this is where you come to enable it when you're ready. Down below here I have my fee section. So here I'm able to charge a printed invoice fee. If I set this to something here, and if you recall in our last video we made a printed invoice fee service, then if a customer is set to receive a printed invoice, they'll get charged whatever fee I have configured here on a monthly basis for that invoice. If I enable late fee application, this allows me to apply late fees to customers if they're late on their bill. And I'm not going to enable this right now because I don't have any fees configured for it, but I'll show you what all the settings are here. If I have this turned on, if I enable this option, then whenever a late fee is applied, I'm going to generate an invoice for it immediately and send it to the customer. If this is not enabled, then that late fee will just get included in the next bill that's generated for them. If I check this, don't apply late fees to child invoices, then if we have a master and child account, let's say for example, I have a commercial customer, they have a central office, and they have 20 branch offices, and I've configured Sonar in such a way that all 20 branch offices all flow up to the master office, and I generate a single invoice that gets sent to the customer that contains all those charges aggregated together. If this is checked, then even if all of those branch offices go unpaid, I'll only generate a single late fee just for the master account. If this is unchecked, and let's say 10 of the child accounts are paid off and 10 are not, then 10 late fees would be applied. So this really just depends on how you want to handle those situations. This option lets us exclude inactive accounts from late fees. So if there's an inactive account that has a past due balance, do you want to give it a late fee or not? You have the option to choose that here. We also have an option to exclude specific account types from late fees. So maybe I don't want to charge late fees to commercial customers. I can choose to exclude them here. And built into Sonar are two types by default, commercial and residential. You can create more under the accounts menu and then account types if you have any others you want to build. Down below that we have the late fee service we want to use. Right now I only have one-time service created, which is my printed invoice fee. I'd need to go create another one-time service here to use for that. We also have an option here to charge a percentage-based late fee. So the way this works is that I would create a debit adjustment service and pick it here. And then I can choose a percent to charge. So if I said 5%, then what Sonar would do is look when we're going to apply a late fee and charge 5% of whatever's past due in this case, or I could make it 10% or 20% or whatever makes sense. And it'll fall back to using the one-time service if the percentage to charge is less than the one-time service. So it's going to be whichever one's greater, either 10% or whatever the amount of my one-time service is here. I can set the minimum amount, and an invoice must be delinquent to be charged a late fee. So if I don't want to charge late fees unless people owe more than X dollars, I can enter that here. And then I have an option to apply my late fee however many days I like after the invoice becomes due. So let's say the invoice is due on the 20th. I want to give them 10 days after that before I apply a late fee. I'll just put 10 in here. Last option down to the bottom here is the minimum transaction amount. So this is going to be for credit card, ACH or e-check transactions. You can limit what the minimum amount is somebody can run on a card here. And this is to stop people coming in and running credit card transactions for a penny, for example, where you have to pay a bigger fee than that to even run it. So you could, this is defaulted to $1. You could come in here and up it to $2, $5, whatever makes the most sense to you. So there's our basic billing config. So the other option that we want to look at here is our billing parameters. So under billing and then billing defaults, this is where we're going to be able to set default parameters for all of our accounts when they're created. And if you're an account super user, you're able to override these on a per account basis if you need to. But generally you want to configure sane defaults here that we can use for all of our customers. So let's run through what these settings are. I'm on the billing default section here. My first option is billing day determination, and this can either be the account activation day or a fixed day. So if this is account activation day, then when we first activate an account, that'll be their billing day. So if we turn an account on the 5th, we're going to bill them on the 5th every month. If we turn them on the 10th, we're going to bill them on the 10th. If I make this fixed day, then we can say there's a particular day of the month that we always bill. So let's say we always bill on the 1st. If I set this to fixed day and I set my billing day to 1, that means even if you're activated on the 5th, your billing day is going to be the 1st. If you're activated on the 10th, your billing day is going to be the 1st. And if we enabled proration in the last screen, then when they're activated on the 10th, we prorate them out from the 10th to the 1st of the next month. How many days before an invoice becomes past due? So if I set this to 10, when an invoice is generated, it will say on the invoice that the invoice is going to be due after the 11th, because we bill on the 1st, we add 10 days, so the 11th is when it's due. And then we have an option to say it becomes delinquent this many days after the past due date. So you may want to tell customers their payments due on the 11th or the 20th or whatever makes sense. But you actually may want to give them a buffer after that before we actually mark the account delinquent and we start processing any delinquency actions on there. So by default this is 3. You can make this whatever makes sense. In my configuration here, that means we bill on the 1st, it'll say the invoice is due on the 11th, and then 3 more days after that the invoice would actually become delinquent. Autopay runs after this many days. If a customer's on autopay and their invoice generates on the 1st, then we can say we want to run autopay 3 days later. We could say 0 days later if we want to run it on the same day, or whatever makes sense for your parameters. Then we can pick a bill mode here, either statement or invoice. We covered this in an earlier video, but a statement is going to include any prior charges on the account that are currently unpaid. An invoice is only going to be the charges that were invoiced during that particular billing period. So generally speaking, residential customers expect a statement, businesses expect an invoice, but this is really up to you. I'm going to leave this on statement right now. Do customers receive a printed invoice by default? If you generally print, you turn this on. If you don't, you turn this off. And we'll come back to this invoice date in a minute because there's a little bit of complexity here. Our last option here is to switch an account into an inactive status after X days of delinquency. So this is on by default, and the purpose of this value is that when a customer goes delinquent, we're still going to keep billing them. We're still going to keep generating transactions every month for them and sending them an invoice. They're still an active customer, they just haven't paid their bill. What you can do is, let's say somebody's been delinquent for 60 days, and your internal process is after 60 days of delinquency you send them to collections, or you make a final attempt to call or whatever. I could come in here and say at that point I want to deactivate their account. I don't want to bill them anymore. I don't want them to get services. And so I can say after 60 days of delinquency I want to move them into status X. I only have 2 inactive statuses in my system right now, but we can build more under accounts and account statuses. So you might want to make a new status here called something like collections, and then we move people into that status after 60 days, and then part of your billing department's responsibility is to review Sonar every day, find all the customers that are in a collection status, and do something to them. If I don't want to do that, I just turn this option off. So our last option here is invoice date different than billing date. So let's just run through this and explain how this works. What this is for when you want to bill on a certain day, but for a different billing period. So let's take a real example. Let's say I want to bill on the 15th of every month for the 1st of the following month. I would come in here and say my billing day is the 15th, but my invoice date is different than my billing date. My invoice date is the 1st. And if I have this checked, this will always go forward until it comes to that next date. So if this was billing on the 15th of January and my invoice date is different than my billing date and it's 1, I'm going to go forward from the 15th of January until I hit the 1st of a month. So that would be the 1st of February. So in that case I'd bill on the 15th of January for a period beginning the 1st of February, or I'd bill on the 15th of February for a period beginning the 1st of March, etc. My other settings down here, autopay runs after which day. So right here where I have autopay runs after this many days, if my invoice date's different than my billing date, does it run 0 days after the billing day, or does it run 0 days after the invoice date? So if I set this to billing, my autopay would run 0 days after the 15th. If I set this to invoice, my auto pay would run 0 days after the 1st. Same day with due date. So is my due date calculated from my invoice day or billing day? Well, my invoice becomes past due after this many days is 10. So do I want the invoice to say it's due 10 days after the 15th, or is it due 10 days after the 1st? There's one other option here to note. When invoice date's different than billing date, if you set these dates to be the same, then it will still go forward until the next date. So if I set these both to 1, then I would bill on the 1st of January for a period beginning the 1st of February. And I would bill on the 1st of February for a period beginning the 1st of March. So once you've set up these defaults to be whatever you want them to be, you also have an option here to go to account type overrides, and I can create an override here. And this allows me to define exactly the same settings, but I can say this overrides accounts that are in a have a type of X, right? So if my defaults apply to everybody except commercial, I could come in here and create an override for commercial accounts and say for commercial accounts maybe they get 90 days before they have to pay their bill, or maybe we run auto pay 30 days after the invoice is generated, or whatever the case may be. When you set up these billing defaults, these only apply to new accounts you're creating. So one thing to note here is if you have accounts you've already input and you realize that your billing parameters are incorrect, coming in here and updating the defaults won't change them. The way you would do that is to go to Financial, and then under Billing we look at Reset Existing Parameters. You can come in here and say for all residential accounts I want to reset specific billing settings. So I could then come in here and say I want to reset all my existing residential accounts to have day billing runs be the 15th, I want to reset the bill mode to statement, etc. And that's how you would come in and override existing accounts if you need to do that.